Benchmark, the voice of business. Presented by LMD.
On this edition of Benchmark, Jenna Edelman, the country director of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, joins us on the program today as we explore Sri Lanka's transportation and land policy. Up next, LMD economist Hasda Premratna brings us up to speed on market sentiment and investor confidence. And Travis Gomez, the product head at Frontier Research, closes the show with an update on a vital component of Sri Lanka's economy, the tourism industry. That's the lineup for Benchmark.
Welcome to Benchmark, the Big Picture Business Program. I'm Savitri Rodrigo. Sri Lanka's transportation and land policy is the focus on Spotlight today. And joining in the discussion is Dr. Jenna Edelman, the country director of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Ahead in the program, we address such issues as the economic impacts of inadequate transport, logistics, infrastructure planning, the policy and institutional reforms that are needed to improve the utilization of land, and the challenges that must be addressed by government as it looks towards modernizing the country's state system. And of course, there's much more topics that will be under discussion in the next 20 to 30 minutes. So welcome, Jenna, to the program. What is your assessment of the quality of Sri Lanka's land administration policy?
Sure. Well, first, thank you very much for hosting me on this program. MCC welcomes any and all opportunities to raise awareness about our grant and what it is that the Sri Lankan government has proposed to us. I'm relatively new here. I've been here for about 6 weeks now, so I'm not an expert on the land sector here. However, my understanding is that land administration in Sri Lanka is highly fragmented and rather inefficient. There are multiple different entities and departments involved, not just under the Ministry of Lands, but across a number of other ministries as well. A lot of the records, most of the records are paper-based. There is not an efficient mechanism in place to resolve land disputes quickly, and land disputes currently account for about 30% of all cases in civil cases in court. There is very little data available on which government entities own land. There are few survey maps available, so it's hard to know who owns what the boundaries are, what the value of the land is, how the land is being used, and whether there are any restrictions on the land use. So those are some of the challenges facing administration of land in Sri Lanka today.
Given your experience, Jenna, being in Africa, in Asia, in India, when you look at Sri Lanka, can you just outline the economic impacts that we have in conjunction with inadequate transport, infrastructure, logistics, and planning?
Well, the economic impacts are huge. I know that Sri Lanka and Colombo specifically envisions itself as becoming a future regional hub for investment, commerce, and trade. And if Colombo is to become that regional hub, it's really important that it get traffic under control and get transportation right so it doesn't become another Manila or Jakarta or Dhaka. We've been working really closely with Moratu University, with the Road Development Authority, and with the Ministry of Megapolis over the past few years on our grant, which includes a $350 million project to reduce congestion in the Colombo metropolitan area and increase travel times. And according to Moratu University, the opportunity cost, the economic cost of congestion will hit 1.8 trillion rupees by next year, so it's rather significant.
Do you think just improving the road infrastructure is sufficient to promote economic growth?
Absolutely not. There needs to be a master plan to improve public transportation across the board. There is very little room in Colombo to expand the existing roadway. One of the advantages of our program is that we're looking to increase efficiency using the existing road network and to improve public transportation, bus transportation specifically. It's nice to see that the government and other development partners are coming in with light rail, with a multimodal hub, with other rail links. All of those are important contributing factors to an improved logistics infrastructure and transportation infrastructure, but it has to come part and parcel with a master plan led by the government so that everything fits together. There are a number of different reform elements that have to be in place as well, particularly the legal and the regulatory reform framework.
You know, according to the World Bank, over 80% of the lands in Sri Lanka is owned by the state. Now, the Millennium Challenge Corporation has pointed out that the process of acquiring rights to develop this land can be slow, it's very unclear, and results in the government not being able to meet the demand for private sector investment. What policies and institutional reforms do you think are needed to improve the utilization of land?
Sure. I would start by saying that these data are not our data. These are data that the government itself have produced, and the World Bank and other development partners have confirmed around the challenges and difficulties faced by the private sector in acquiring and registering land. The government is considering a number of different important institutional and policy changes. One of the things that they have proposed to us for grant funding is that we create what's called a land policy research group, or a land policy secretariat, essentially, which would report to the government. It would be made up of Sri Lankan experts, political experts, policy experts, lawyers, who can look at evidence about what's happening in the land sector here in Sri Lanka, who can look at some of the challenges and best practice tailored to the Sri Lankan context. And the whole objective of this secretariat is to make policy recommendations to the government, legislative amendment recommendations in consultation with the public, because public outreach and public feedback is absolutely critical. So some of the specific reforms that this group might consider would be things like joint titling and inheritance reform. Is there an economic benefit and a social stability benefit to joint titling, for example? Are there any negative impacts because joint titling is now not the default? Another example would be the pros and cons, the benefits and the risks of converting grants in state land to freehold rights. Is there a way to stimulate economic activity in rural areas as a result of a policy amendment along those lines?
Which best practices and trends do you think could be adopted to address the constraints to economic growth in Sri Lanka?
Sure. Well, the approach that MCC has employed from the very beginning, we've been around for 15 years now, is to ask eligible partner countries to propose to us what they view as their binding constraints to economic growth. And we think that works really well because it means you have ownership. The country is developing its own priorities, and you're much more likely to fund investments, projects that are sustainable over the longer term. So looking at transportation specifically, and speaking from my own personal experience of more than 13 years now with MCC in many different countries, I would say that it's important for there to be ownership, it's important for there to be capacity, to have appropriate operations and maintenance funding in place, especially where we're funding major capital investment projects. Like here in Sri Lanka, the government has proposed to us that we upgrade interprovincial roads in the central and suburban provinces, and that we address this traffic problem in Colombo by introducing an advanced traffic management system and modernizing the bus sector. So public transportation is better, safer, more comfortable, and more reliable, and more people take public transportation as a result. So working hand in hand with the Ministry of Megapolis and Road Development Authority, we will be able to ensure that the government has the appropriate capacity in place to manage and operate those systems, and the appropriate funding in place to sustain them over the longer term. Moving to land for just a minute, MCC has supported our partner countries' efforts in more than 10 partner countries now to improve land administration. And there I would say the best practice is to support existing partner country policies and initiatives, just like we're doing here in Sri Lanka, just like what has been proposed to us. Land is a very controversial topic and a very emotional topic, not just here in Sri Lanka, but in a lot of places where we work. But we don't want to bite off more than we can chew, and we want to do what the country wants. So we have a lot of success stories in land as well. For example, in Mongolia, we were able to improve the existing deed registry system to make transactions quicker and increase the number of land transactions. In Mali, MCC grant funding was requested to develop about 5,000 hectares of irrigation land and to give land rights for the first time to farmers living in that irrigation area. In Ghana, the first formal land rights were given to citizens citizens living on more than 25 hectares of land. And in Benin, because smallholders were given more secure land tenure rights, we've seen a switch to longer-term, higher-value crops like tree planting and perennials. So those are some of the best practices that we've seen in transported land law.
Commercial break now, just to catch your breath. And so we've been chatting with Dr. Edelman, and she'll be back after this commercial break. And we ask her what was the reason for Sri Lanka to be chosen for the MCC Compact, and also the impact of the upcoming election on Sri Lanka's partnership with the MCC. Stay with us.
LMD is making waves, airwaves. The next big thing from Sri Lanka's pioneering business journal, LMD Podcast, now online. Listen to our articles on the go at www.lmd.lk. Select, play, listen. It's that simple.
$8,500 done. 1,500 to go. Hoorah!
What on earth are you doing?
I'm making money.
You're crazy.
Crazy for money. 10,000 steps done. Who the man? I do it every single day. Show me the money.
So you run 10,000 steps every day, huh? You must be fit.
Some days I do 20,000. Hoorah!
Thank you for staying with Benchmark. We now resume our discussion with the Country Director of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, Dr. Jenna Edelman. Jenna, if the government's e-state lands information management system, or e-SLIMS as it's called, was designed to host a complete inventory of state land that's vested with various government agencies. And it's also looking at digitizing records of deeds and link them to digital parcel information to build on its e-land. Now, in your opinion, will the government's planned digitization efforts effectively address critical issues, some of which you have brought up, in the country's approach to land administration?
I think it will certainly help the government manage state lands more efficiently. There are about 1.1 million parcels of state lands that need to be surveyed and inputted into that system. State Land Management Information System was created a number of years ago, but unfortunately has been historically under-resourced over the years, so it's not fulfilling its purpose right now. It's not facilitating land transactions and making them any easier. By funding this inventory and a cadastral map, what we're doing is giving the government the ability to link all these different data systems together. So in one single database, you would have information on land ownership for state lands. You would have information on the exact boundaries of that land, any encumbrances or other restrictions, how the land is being used. And once we get a new valuation system, a more efficient valuation system in place, you would also have the value of that land. So it becomes a one-stop shop, so to speak, for the government, and it provides information in a much more transparent manner that's available to the public, available to lending institutions, and available to potential investors. And the whole point of it is to increase the use of land as an economic asset and thereby stimulate economic growth.
So I've been looking at various media reports, and you've stated more often than not that while there are no strings attached to the grant, the US has interest in Sri Lanka as its largest trading partner, which is there on record. Now, meanwhile, however, US President Donald Trump has been looking to reduce spending on foreign aid programs, but US assistance to Sri Lanka has amounted to over $2 billion since 1948. What are the reasons for MCC to select Sri Lanka's proposal, and why now?
Sure, that's a very good question, and one that I get frequently and I'm more than happy to answer. So MCC uses a competitive selection process annually to fairly and transparently determine which countries are eligible for our very limited grant funds. We only have a couple dozen active partners at any one time, and all of our grants are several $100 million. They're big grants. And the reason Sri Lanka is eligible is because it's a good performer on our indicators against its peers in the lower middle income category. So we use 20 different transparent third-party indicators in 3 different categories: economic freedom, good governance, and investing in people, how much your country, your government is spending on health and education and natural resource management, for example. And Sri Lanka does quite well on those indicators and has for the past several years. So that's the reason that Sri Lanka is eligible.
So MCC's focus on backward mapping strategies to optimize policymaking and implementation is said to have had a drastic impact on how the US provides development aid. Critics of the MCC Sri Lanka Compact, however, have expressed concerns over the implications of accepting the grant in conjunction with military agreements, especially as Sri Lanka has historically maintained a foreign policy of non-alignment. What is your opinion?
My opinion is that I regret deeply that MCC's grant has become conflated with the renewal of these 2 military agreements. I can honestly say that before I arrived here 6 weeks ago, I had never heard of SOFA or AXA ever. They are longstanding agreements that Sri Lanka has had in place with the U.S. government since the mid-90s and since 2007, and which the U.S. government has in place with over 100 countries worldwide. MCC is completely independent. We are apolitical. We have legislation. We're statutorily prohibited from using any of our funding for military purposes. We're a development organization, very much like USAID, and there's zero connection whatsoever between MCC's grant and these other 2 military renewals. They're not contingent on one another. The other point that I would add is that MCC's grant was finalized and negotiated by a team of Sri Lankans basically a year ago now, in October 2018 in Washington. We had a delegation, a negotiations team, chaired by the Secretary to the Treasury, come to Washington for 2 weeks to finalize all the details of all the different activities and the terms of the agreement. It was only because of the constitutional crisis later that month that we were unable to sign the grant as planned late last calendar year.
So in what way does the policy influence of MCC's funding grants differ from that of what China is giving us, for instance?
Well, our funding is grant funding. I think that's the primary distinguishing factor. In addition to that, none of our aid has conditions tied to it. There's nothing that says, for example, that our contracts have to go to American contractors. In fact, if you look at how we have awarded contracts globally, we've committed over $13 billion now in grants to nearly 30 partner countries. Only 7% of our contract awards go to American companies because domestic companies, international companies are able to compete a lot more successfully. Even a smaller percentage goes to Chinese companies because we have a policy against awarding contracts to majority state-owned enterprises, and some Chinese companies are subsidized by the government. So those, I think, are 2 important distinguishing factors. In addition to that, our grants around the world are developed by our country partners, they are implemented by our country partners, and they are overseen by our country partners. So there will only ever be 2 Americans here. Our role is to provide oversight and make sure that our procurement guidelines are being followed and sound financial management is being exercised. But in the same way that the government proposed this grant to us and all the activities in it, it will be implemented by a professional team of 65 Sri Lankans, headed by a CEO. And it will be overseen by a Sri Lankan board of directors that will include representatives from the Prime Minister's office, the President's office, the secretaries of all the ministries we're working with, and it will be chaired by the Secretary to the Treasury. It will also include private sector and civil society members. So that's very important to us, that we have country ownership across the board from start to finish. This grant was proposed to us by the government in consultation with Sri Lankan private sector and civil society, the think tank and research community, university community over a period of a few years. And now we're in a place where unfortunately it's become politicized, but we hope that it is temporary, and we will look to the government, the new government, to communicate to us whether they would like to accept this grant or not.
In 2016, the foreign agency seized, your foreign agency seized activities related to the development of a second compact in Tanzania. As the MCC Board of Directors stated, that the elections held in March in Zanzibar were neither inclusive nor representative. And as the government had not taken measures to ensure freedom of expression and association are respected in the implementation of the Cybercrimes Act. Now we have an election coming up. How are these upcoming elections going to impact Sri Lanka's partnership with the MCC?
Well, we're hopeful that the elections will be conducted in a free and fair and transparent manner. And if that's the case, then they shouldn't have any impact at all on our relationship, our partnership with the Sri Lankan government. We have seen a number of changes in government and changes in administration over the years. Our programs typically take 2 or 3 years to develop, just as the Sri Lanka program did here. Implementation is 5 years. And then we also have a design and startup phase that takes between 18 months and 2 years' time. So that said, our governance criteria are important. That's how we select our partners. So we look at policies. We look at whether or not elections are conducted in a free and fair manner, and we partner with whichever governments are elected by our partner countries, so long as that's done fairly.
Thanks very much, Jenna.
Thank you.
So the Millennium Challenge Corporation's Sri Lanka Compact, as well as land utilization and transport and logistics infrastructure, has been the focus on Spotlight today. We've been speaking with Dr. Jenna Edelman, the country director of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. On the other side, we have Anushan Sevaraja with more.
LMD is making waves, airwaves. The next big thing from Sri Lanka's pioneering business journal, LMD Podcast, now online. Listen to our articles on the go at www.lmd.lk. Select, play, listen. It's that simple.
$8,500 done. 1,500 go. Hoorah!
What on earth are you doing?
I'm making money.
You're crazy.
Crazy for money. 10,000 steps done. Who the man? I do it every single day. Show me the money.
So you run 10,000 steps every day, huh? You must be fit.
Some days I do 20,000. Hoorah!
Hello and welcome back to Benchmark. I'm Anushan Sevaraja. Now for a closer look at the latest on the bourse. Joining me is market analyst and LMD columnist Hasita Premratna. Welcome back to the show, Hasita. Now, as usual, just to start off, how is the bourse performing?
So market has been pretty flat in the last few weeks. It has had a minor decline in the last couple of months, and then afterwards it has seen again a pickup, slow pickup. So the share price index has been hovering around 5,750 to about 5,850 range. It's a relatively volatile market condition, but not necessarily backed by a lot of activity. And the retailers have been becoming slowly active in the market from where it was, and the foreign participation on the other hand has been on the opposite direction. But overall, what we're seeing is that the sentiment is building towards the presidential election and the outcome of that election on one side, and on the other side it's also being kind of skeptical given the global uncertainties that are currently prevailing.
Now there was a recent spike in the performance of the bourse, and according to various media outlets, it was due to this reason or the other. Could you just elaborate on what the reason, actual reason was?
I think the month of July we saw about a 10% surge in the index within a very short period of time, and especially after it had been not doing too well for a long time. So it sounded in a way a kind of a re-rating of the market, which was anyway bound to happen. It was looking for reasons, and then with the presidential election being announced on one side, there was a sentiment-driven move that drove the market on one side to a positive note. On the other side also we saw the interest rates, central bank taking some serious notes on reducing the interest rate. So we saw the benchmark rates coming down to single digits and digits, and also the central bank imposing strict regulations and governance around the lending and the borrowing rate. So this has brought the interest rates down, and that obviously is a positive for the market, because people, when they don't get enough return to on their fixed deposits, they look for alternative investments, and alternative investments obviously, when you look at the quickest place that you can go in is the stock market. So with that there was some surge as well. Apart from that, of course, the global uncertainty was looming, but certainly we were seeing a faster recovery from the Easter attacks than what was anticipated. So these conditions did give a boost and gave some sort of a re-rating to the market in the month of July, but that has not really seen to a sustainable drive upward momentum, but instead is more or less being hanging around at those levels since then.
What about the currency then, Hasit? How is that performing, and how do you see it performing going forward?
Yeah, so currency at the time, especially during the month of July, August, looked like it was becoming quite stable and staying around, strengthening at around 178, 77, 76 levels. But then again, now we've seen it moving on the other direction, and the last month or so, we've seen on one side the global impact coming in with the trade war and the related activities. All the emerging market currencies started to depreciate, especially after China consciously depreciated their currency against the US dollar. That on one side helped the emerging market currencies, which were anyway on a declining trend, but in the meantime it got adjusted to some extent. But also from a local front, we've seen that the imports have been reducing. That's the main reason why the rupee was strengthening, because the current account deficit, if you look at in the last 5 months, have been narrowing, and the trade deficit has also been narrowing, because the imports are reducing and exports are holding or improving a little bit beyond what was originally expected. So as a result, what we've seen is that the rupee was on a strengthening mode overall, but with the second half coming in, now the imports are slowly starting to pick up, and things are going back to not necessarily normalcy, but also to an extent that it's getting back towards the normal trend, which means that the trade the deficit, which is currently in a controlled manner, might again slowly widen a bit. So as a result of that, probably the currency also started to move, and central banks shown some intervention to hold it at a particular level, or at least to reduce its movement. Some intervention was seen.
Thank you very much for joining us, Hasita.
Thank you.
That was market analyst and LMD columnist Hasita Premratna. We'll be right back after a short commercial break. Stay tuned.
LMD is making waves, airwaves. The next big thing from Sri Lanka's pioneering business journal, LMD Podcast, now online. Listen to our articles on the go at www.lmd.lk. Select, play, listen. It's that simple.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Anshan Selvaraja. Continuing our focus on the recovery of the tourism sector, joining me now is product head from Frontier Research, Travis Gomez. Welcome back to the show, Travis. Now, how has the recovery process been so far?
So starting from about June, what we've seen is that in terms of the numbers, things had seemed to be recovering. June, July, August, month on month, there was improvements in the tourist arrivals. But looking at the most recent numbers, there was a bit of a drop. So in September, they were expecting about 150,000 tourists, so partly helped by, there was also the Bora convention that was happening in that month, but I think the actual number was about 110,000, so that was a bit of a disappointment, and now really we are getting into the sort of the high growth tourism phase. So I think there's a lot of operators though are quite worried about the numbers. So the hotel association chairman was saying that the hotels are pretty much gearing for like about a 30 or 50% reduction in their occupancy compared to last year. So we're kind of entering into some challenging times.
What about our recovery in terms of our revenue?
So right now the numbers are for January to August, it's about 250 million USD, so that's about 28% reduction compared to the previous year. So what seems to be happening, and what a lot of the other studies have been showing, is that although the arrival numbers have been going up and a lot of the occupancy has been boosted by local tourism, the earnings will take longer to catch up, because a lot of this is driven by, the numbers are driven by a lot of these great deals that the hotels are doing to stay afloat. And given again that we're entering another period of some sort of political uncertainty, again that would also probably play into the numbers as well, where some of the tourists might still be a bit hesitant to come in. So I would expect that we are still in for like a challenging period.
We just reopened the Palali airport after 41 years and it's now been named the Jaffna International Airport. What are the implications of this for the tourism sector?
So I feel that's actually a good development, because if you look in terms of the Indian market, that has been one of the markets that has been, when it comes to the arrivals, that and given the close proximity, there's a lot of opportunity there. So particularly we can tap into sort of like the people who are coming here for pilgrimages, for different sort of things, as well as the business related ones, because a lot of the tourists, the Indian tourists who are coming, would be business oriented, and typically they tend to like spend more as well. So I think that's a good relationship to develop. Another area actually that we should be looking into is maybe trying to attract some of those budget airlines, which I think what the new airport is also trying to attract. So yeah, if we can get that off the ground, then again that would help to sort of reduce the cost and to sort of make us more competitive with some of the other destinations in Asia. So that's another plus point.
Thank you very much for joining us, Travis.
Thank you.
That was the product head of Frontier Research, Travis Gomez, with an update on the recovery in the tourism sector. Thank you for watching Benchmark, and we hope to see you again next time.